Welcome, everyone, to the March 11th, 2025, Second Tuesday. This month's Second Tuesday is going to be a little bit different from previous ones in that I'm actually on vacation today, being March 11th, so I'm not available to take questions on the fly. I'm actually out of telephone range, so you'll be able to email your questions, or we have other people like Christoph on this call that should be able to answer your questions at the end of today's session. Today's session is called Why Delta E Doesn't Always Work. And it's part two, because last month we talked about why Delta E doesn't work for certain reasons. And this month, we're covering some other reasons why Delta E might not necessarily work. Now, it does work for the most part if you know what to do and how to use it. And that's what we'll be covering. But before we do that, we're going to go over some recent ChromaChecker improvements, such as one of the things we promised at the color conference was a sales directory. We have found that numerous print buyers and brand companies have come to us and said, hey, who's using ChromaChecker? Because we find if someone's using ChromaChecker, we know if they're going to meet our expectations for color. So instead of us giving you their names, we've built into ChromaChecker now a sales directory where you as a print organization can enter information about the types of printing you do, large format, high volume, low volume, other special capabilities that you have. You fill it out in the ChromaChecker sales registry along with the sales contact. And print buyers and brand companies that are using ChromaChecker will be able to find you based on your print capabilities and your location and reach out to you. And using our project technology, which we talked about 2 months ago, it makes it really easy to send the print specs using the project inspector so that everything is clear in terms of what they're expecting from the print and proving that you can deliver what they're expecting. So other QC software won't share what printers are using their software. We will, as long as the brand and print broker have a ChromaChecker license, then they can find you in the print sales registry section and hopefully give you more business. We've got one customer, actually two customers, a print broker and a PSP, a print service provider, that in July, the PSP told me they had 1 million new jobs from this one print broker because of ChromaChecker. So this is a reason to have ChromaChecker within your organization as a print quality program, because it allows brand companies to find you and use you for your print expertise. The second thing we've added in the last 30 days is we've always had the ability to support data loggers. And a data logger is an instrument that collects temperature and humidity and uploads to the cloud, and you can put the parameters around what capabilities your printer needs to operate in. So if the humidity or temperature goes out of whack, it warns you before the printer starts printing bad color. Well, we've now added the ability to color code different data loggers for different rooms so that you can track very easily how your temperature and humidity is performing across different locations within your facility in real time using different color codes. The next thing we've added is new project inspector reporting. Project inspector is being used more and more, and we're getting really good input from you guys in terms of what you're wanting to see. Thank you for that. And this information came in from our conference. And so we've added the ability to make the report more condensed. So if when you're in Capture and you're measuring a project, if you want to see the project timeline, it not only shows you the last 50 measurements of the project, but it also shows you the timeline on the right. This is a lot more information in a lot smaller area, which is really useful to know whether or not your project that you're measuring off the print process is normally consistent, or if it all of a sudden went out of whack for some reason and you need to fix it. So much more information here. And then the other thing that we've added is the ability to include the control strip on the snowflake page from within Capture. And you'll see the tab now with include snowflake is checked off here. So with that, let's get right into this month's topic, which is why delta E doesn't work. And last month, this was our agenda. So part one was we talked about how to quantify color differences. We talked about the delta E equation. We talked about different formulas. We talked about the history, talked about some different definitions. And then we took you through some exercises to experience how the different delta E formulas render colors so you can see the differences, and how to visualize the delta E's for your important colors, and how the LAB color space isn't linear or doesn't align naturally with how our eye sees color. So there's times that a color will show a high delta E when our eye says it doesn't look that high. And we showed using the variator, which is this phenomenal tool, how you can show all combinations of a certain delta E. In this case, if I hold it right side up, this is all occurrences of a 2.5 delta E against the reference color. So you can see every occurrence of a 2.5 delta E against a reference color. And what often happens is people say, you know, I'm okay with all these, but I'm not okay with this or this one. So I'm not okay with this circle and this circle. And so we end up having to do a snowflake variation to accommodate that, which makes it more accurate than delta E. It's just breaking the delta E into the components so that your color really does match the expectation, and you eliminate false fails and false passes where people say, hey, this doesn't look right, even though you say the delta E is right, which delta E is right, but delta E doesn't correlate perfectly to our eye in all colors and all aspects of the color. And Snowflake fixes this. And so that's last month's. This month, part two, we're going to focus more on what M condition we're using for the measurement devices. The M condition was developed, well, a lot of development, and started to be published in 2009, which we'll talk about, which helps align with the viewing conditions. And the viewing conditions have changed over the last 10 years. And so things don't always work as we expect, but it really makes a difference in terms of how we perceive delta E and how we measure delta E. So we're going to talk about really how the M condition and the viewing conditions are critical components to ensure that the delta E formula that you use for the given M condition lines up. And by the way, everything I'm doing in this presentation is based on delta E 2000, so you know. And then at the end, we're going to have two actual customer use cases of actual examples, delta E's, and visual perception in terms of how these prints look under different environments. And I've actually got pictures. Pictures are hard because there's something called an observer metamerism, which gets influenced by how the picture is taken and the array of the camera itself. And anyway, we'll talk through that, but we've attempted to make it as good as we could for this presentation. So let's talk about M conditions. When you get a measurement device, at least a modern measurement device, the measurement device typically has the ability to measure in 3 or 4 M conditions. And these are the M conditions that are available today. And that doesn't count a spherical instrument. A spherical instrument has spin and spec with and without UV. So it's almost like, in a way, M conditions, but for sphere measurements, which you can look up that in a previous Second Tuesday seminar from about 6 months ago. We talk about spheres. But anyway, we're talking 45-0 instruments today with M conditions. And M0 is kind of a legacy condition with a standard illuminant A, which is like an incandescent light bulb, which is how older instruments measured color. 2009 M this whole M series was introduced, and the concept was we should have the same illuminant in the measurement device as we do in the light booth in terms of where we're viewing, so that the light of the instrument illuminates color in the same way that the light booth that we're using to look at color illuminates. So this is a key aspect of this. And so M1 was a mode D50, which simulates a standard illuminant light booth with UV. And then the M2 is the same thing, but without UV. So there's a UV cutoff filter. And then M3 adds a polarization filter to the mix. And there's use cases in terms of when to use which M condition. And depending upon the effect of the OBA, since so many papers have OBA in them, and OBA, by the way, optical brightener agents, which these optical brightener agents in paper get excited by the UV of the light, which is in an ISO 3664 2009 illuminant, or UV light is also in the sunlight. So when UV light excites the paper, it changes the appearance of the paper and the color on the paper. So depending upon what you're trying to do, we built this table to try to guide people in terms of when to use which instrument. And it can be a little confusing, but I think that kind of the industry standard has been, hey, Grackle 2013 is based on M1, we should probably use M1. And this slide talks about when OBA is a variable to deal with. Because if you don't have OBA in your environment, like you're running a CRB type stock, a consumer recycle board, something like that, life becomes a whole lot easier. It never got hard, really, because CRB really never had UV in it. But conditions where OBA is a factor is when the substrate has OBAs manufactured into them, and the illuminant has a UV component which excites those OBAs. If either of the above do not exist, then OBA typically is not an issue. Meaning, if you run with a paper without optical brighteners, or if you're viewing it in a condition without UV, then the OBA issue becomes a non-issue. Now, important to note that most, if not all, indoor illuminants today are LED, or quickly will be. Fluorescent is quickly making its way out the door, and LED is taking over. And we've got a public library of LED illuminants built into ChromaChecker. We're talking hundreds of LED illuminants, and not one of the standard illuminants for a normal lighting condition has UV in it, because you have to purposely put it in it. So like this light booth is an LED light booth, and it does have UV because it was purposely put in there in order to accurately render to ISO 3664 2009. But you'll notice there is a button here in the lower corner that says no UV. So I can actually hit this button and turn UV off in the light booth, which is quite handy. Now, if your job that you're printing is going to be viewed inside, then we can pretty much assume that the lighting that's going to illuminate the job will not have UV in it. So OBA should not be an issue, which means we don't need to measure an M1. Kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but giving you an idea where we're going. Only jobs illuminated by sunlight, UV, should be affected if the paper has optical brighteners built into it. And this is part of the reason why most modern light booths now, meaning this light booth is maybe a year and a half old, have this ability to turn off the UV, because more and more UV is a variable that gets in the way of managing color. And if we can just eliminate the UV, because there won't be UV in the actual product viewing, then why even have it? So with that, if we go to Grackle, Graco 2013, it's M1. Everyone's thinking, oh, well, Graco 2013 is what I'm trying to aim for, or for version of the M1. And they say, yeah, let's do M1. But anyone who's spent a lot of time measuring color in M1 has found that it doesn't always work. And I say, what do you mean it doesn't always work? Well, it means that the delta E numbers that you measure in M1 don't necessarily correlate with how our vision sees the color, even in a UV environment. Does UV and OBA tend to make it hard for us to match color and make it so that the delta E numbers that we read off the instrument do not correlate with how my eye sees the color? Well, number one is OBA is a liquid, which means it evaporates, and sometimes fast. I've seen OBA on pages change over the course of a week. One of my customers had a hockey puck test. Being from Minnesota, you put a hockey puck on the paper, leave it out in the environment. After a week, pick up that hockey puck and see if the color under the puck is different than the surrounding color. And this will tell you how much the OBA has changed. Well, you think about that. You can't have color changing by a delta E or two over the course of a week or two, because it might take that long to create the print and get your customer to approve it. OBA becomes an unmanageable variable. It's ridiculous, frankly. And if there's no UV in the actual application of what you're using, well, OBA becomes a non-issue altogether. And if there's no OBA in the substrate, then there's no reason to use M1 to start with. And I'm not even going to get into the fact that if you take how instruments measure the levels of UV, whether it's an I1, an Exact, a Teshcon, Barbieri, even though there's a technical standard for M1, all the instruments measure this technical standard for M1 differently. And if you can imagine, we set a spec to measure a certain amount of UV with these instruments, which are not consistent even within a manufacturer line. But now, what about the paper? The paper's not fixed. The OBA index in a paper could be 3, could be 6, could be 15. And there's a point where the M1 technology in the instrument can't compensate for the amount of UV in the paper. There's a limit to how much the instrument can actually handle. And what we've typically been saying for a number of years is that if the fluorescent index or the OBA index is more than 6, chances are the M1's not going to work very well, and don't use it. So these are things that have been going on in the industry, which is important. And let's move right into case study 1. This is a case study from an actual customer of mine. And this customer essentially was using an M1 condition, and they were telling me they built their profiles in M1, they built their conversions in M1, and then they looked at the prints and they didn't look right. So they ended up making profiles in M0 and in M2, took the same file, ran it through the color conversions of M0, M1, and M2, and then put it in their light booth and viewed it under a ISO 3664 UV environment. And this is what the print actually looks like. So when we look at this print is showing that on the left side, oh, stop running away from me. On the left side, we have the M0 profiled print. On the middle, we have the M1 profiled print. And on the right, we have the M2 profiled print. Now, focus, if you will, on the middle image and the middle gray at the bottom of the screen. Does that look gray to you? And I would hope everyone would say, no, that looks a bit yellow. Now look at the same patch an M2 at the bottom middle of the screen. That looks great. So this company learned many years ago that in their environment for what they do, they should be doing M2. And if you look at the brand colors that are on the middle left side, the colors on the right in M2 actually look more like what the brand colors are supposed to look like versus the middle or the left. And if you just focus on the cloud image on the upper left, that's another thing that you'll see. The cloud image looks real yellow and some of the details kind of lost there, where when you look on the right, that's what the original is supposed to look like. So not only general gray, but also the quality of the image and quality of the brand colors all look better in M2 versus M1 in this case study that these guys went through. Now, I just finished a case study myself, and the case study that I did was taking these prints of a door, and essentially 6 different vendors rendered the color of the door. And the top is representing what the door is supposed to look like. And then vendors 1 through 5 are the simulations of how well the vendor did at matching the door. And by the way, this was all set up for Grackle 2013 in an M1 condition. And what I did was I took these prints and I laid them out under an LED D50 light source, no UV, and I stack ranked them in terms of order of which one looked the closest to the original. So vendor 1 looks the closest to the original. Vendor 2, the next closest. Vendor 3, the next closest. Vendor 4, the next closest. Vendor 5, the next closest. Then I used Project Inspector in ChromaChecker and Print Inspector, and these prints all had the 12647-7 ID Alliance 3-row target on it. And what was interesting is the E factor correlated exactly with my visual perception of which images or which doors look the closest to the original. But we're not talking about E factor here. We're talking about delta E. So I'll just keep it to delta E and show you now the delta E differences between these doors that I measured. So in a spreadsheet, I took the original, it was the top, so that's the 0. And then vendor 1, going across the 5 different door colors, 0.7, 0.6, 0.4, 0.1, 0.4. So that correlated exactly with what my eyes said in terms of which door was closest. And if you look down the list, the numbers are all linear. There's no inconsistency there. And vendor 4 was the second worst, and vendor 5 was the worst. So the yellow and the red represent the second. The yellow represents the second worst delta E's, and the red represents the first, the highest delta E's. And this is all being done in an M2 condition. So I measured the samples in an M2 condition, and I'm looking at them in a non-UV light source, and it all correlates. Delta E works in this scenario. So if you know how to use delta E for the most part in this type of process, it works fantastic. Now, let's throw a wrench into it. Let's go ahead and show the picture I took of the images as I stack ranked them for indoor LED lighting. I took them outside, and then I looked at them and I thought, oh, sorry, we're still inside. So here's the inside picture, and you see how the delta E's look. And yeah, trust me, the bottom row, if you look at that middle gray on the bottom row, the dark gray, the middle one, that was visually the farthest off of any of the colors to the top doors. And the delta E shows that clearly. So thumbs up for delta E on that. Now what I did was I took these samples and I transported them outside and I looked at them, and you could see, look, did you see the difference in look at the blue, right? The blue from the light, right? So if I go back and I go forward, It's really, again, I use my phone to take these pictures, but so they're not perfect, but it does give you a sense of what's going on. And so then I measured in M1 the delta E differences between these samples. And when you look at this, you'll say, oh my goodness, it's inconsistent. And yeah, it's very inconsistent. And it's funny. I was looking at this and I'm like, oh, Delta E is saying version 4, vendor 4 is the most off. And I went back and I re-looked, I switched vendor 4 with vendor 5. And I'm like, yeah, vendor 4 is the worst vendor. So actually, the Delta E's, the majority of the Delta E's here actually did work because vendor 4 visually in UV light looks worse than vendor 5, which, you hear what I'm saying? In LED lighting, vendor 5 looked like the worst match, but in UV lighting, vendor 4 had the worst visual match. And the Delta E's do correlate that. So when I go here and I put the Delta E's on top of the door, you can see if we go to vendor 4, and again, I'll focus on that dark gray door in the middle. The vendor 4, it was very red. Vendor 5 was very green. But when I put both of those against the original, the vendor 4 was a higher visual delta E difference than vendor 5. In fact, all of the colors were different. So in that way, I reordered this. So now here's the switch of the delta E's, because visually the UV light made me change my mind in terms of which one was farthest away, and it better correlates with my vision. So vendor 4 is now in the last place position with the highest delta E's. Vendor 5 is above it. But it still doesn't explain why, like, the blue white on vendor 2 is reporting a higher delta E than the blue white of vendor 4, which is the worst vendor overall. And if we come back here, and again, hard to see with the picture, but I took the images and put them right on top of one another. Vendor 2's second blue that shows a 2.5 looked closer than vendors 4 and 5. And yet the delta E reported a higher delta E on vendor 2. So this is one of those idiosyncrasies where delta E doesn't always work. And part of the problem is that vendor 2 does have optical brighteners and UV in their paper, which is influencing how the M1 measurement device is measuring that value. And it's actually throwing a bunch of the values off for vendor 2, where vendor 3, vendor 1, the original, they had almost no UV or no optical brighteners in their papers. So it just shows the wild card of the OBA rearing its head here, causing the delta E's to not necessarily correlate with how our vision sees the color difference. And this is just critical, because anyone who's done any amount of color matching, what I'm saying, I think is ringing a bell, and you're saying, yes, I've experienced this, and I'm substantiating. And we as an industry have to really, I think, educate customers that this is an issue and that we need to solve it. And some of the best ways to solve it is to really move to a non-OBA, non-UV condition. And I say here, hey, the industry could really use a Grackle with a low fluorescent index or OBA index. And those of you that came to our conference learned that the industry is coming out with a universal data set for merging the Folger standard and the Grackle standard into one universal data set. So we don't have a Folger standard and a US standard that people have to compensate the differences for. Even though the differences are only about it's a 2.1 E factor, they're still different. And so the industry is moving to one universal data set. There were some delays unfortunately, due to some missteps that some people took. But the good news is that this should be released later this year, maybe the beginning of next year. And this data set will have a very low level of OBA in the paper. So this is a big step toward the industry fixing this issue that we're dealing with related to M1. So until then, educate customers to avoid substrates with OBA, choose papers that don't have OBAs. We need to get the word out that OBAs today, manufacturers put OBAs in the paper to make the papers look brighter when they're excited by UV light. The fact that fluorescence gone away, there's no UV in the lights anymore, so there's no reason to put OBAs in to excite the paper to make it white. That whole reasoning has gone out the window. So you can still buy paper which is visually white and bright without optical brighteners in them. Now, how do you tell if a paper has optical brighteners? Well, ideally use Capture. Capture has a real slick tool that allows you within ChromaChecker to measure a paper color. And I measured one right here, and you see the OBA index is 9.2, the fluorescent index is 8.2. And like I mentioned in an earlier slide, anything over 3, try to stay away from. Try to stay away from. And Capture will actually show you, if you click on the fluorescent tab on the right here, it will show you where the peak of the UV is. And it's obviously in the blue, and it's essentially contributing 30% more blue to the measurement than what is actually there, which is causing this mismatch between how our eyes see color and how the instrument sees color. So this is an important part of fixing this problem. Now, I want to call out FOGRA here in a good way, because FOGRA has a project going on called D50 No UV. And this D50 No UV is a project where they've asked the industry to take samples of the light sources that they view color under and submit them to them. And you can do this with ChromaChecker using Capture if your instrument is like a, if it's a Calibrite Studio, if it's a Miro 1, if it's an I1, all of these instruments work with Capture, so you can capture the ambient light as a digital file and submit it to them. And they've got hundreds of submissions, and the data is pretty overwhelming that so far everything is no UV. And so this is the FOGRA light or illuminant tester. So it shows you what level of UV is in the illuminant. And right now I'm showing you the tester in my light booth. And if you take a look at A in this top white, if it matches A, means there's a high level of illuminant in the light source, which makes sense because it's my light booth and I currently have my UV on to meet ISO 3664 standards. Now, if I push the UV off button, watch carefully, and now you'll see there's a mismatch on A and there's a match on F. It's mirrored because of the camera, but you notice how much closer F is. And so this is showing you there's no UV in the light. And then the concept of this tester is you put it in different illuminants and you say which letter best corresponds to this top white. And that's the amount of UV in the light source, with A being a lot and F being 0. Now, the other way to do this, of course, is to use an I1 and measure the light source and contribute the data to FOGRA so that they can calculate how much UV is in different people's light sources. And what we found is that, ideally, if we put a UV blocker on the lighting itself, so I'm turning off the UV off button, so now the UV's on, so you see it's matching A again. But there's these commercially available UV blockers. This piece of plastic that I have here is a UV blocker. And as I put it up with the UV on, notice that the match now goes back to F. So putting this blocker in front of the light essentially blocks out all the UV. And FYI, I was at the Dolly Museum in St. Pete a couple weeks ago, and they have a number of skylights illuminating their artwork. And I asked, and all the skylights have a UV block on them to try to eliminate the UV from fading the artwork within that museum, which makes total sense. But in this case, we're talking about putting it in a light booth or any type of environment where you could have UV in to just eliminate the effect of OBAs on the paper. So that leads us to the summary of why delta E doesn't always work, is that the M condition greatly affects the results of delta E. If work is going to be viewed inside, move toward an M2 condition. Even if prints are used outside, avoid OBAs. In fact, one of the big messages here is move away from substrates with OBAs and educate customers to move away from substrates using OBAs. Life will be a whole lot easier as soon as we move out of the OBA influence in our substrates. And as you're doing this, to make your current light booths work, add a UV filter to the light booth. You know, I'll tell you, we talked about adding UV light filters to light booths back in 2010, 2011, when we started experiencing a whole lot of issues related to color mismatches with proof to press. And I know companies have already done that, and you're way ahead of the curve, but we still have to deal with papers with OBAs. And hopefully this presentation helps educate you on what you can do to manage your color with OBAs in a more effective way to help make delta E work versus not work and give you unexpected and unpredictable results. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this month's seminar. Please follow us on LinkedIn. And please, if you haven't tried ChromaChecker yet, we have a new trial that's available with Capture. And ask us and we'll guide you for directions on how to activate it so you can actually use your I1. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to quit out of the presentation and just show you how easy Capture is to measure UV. So here's my Capture. I launched it and it automatically went into my quick checker because I set that up on the software. Default, it might come into Print Inspector, but just flip it to the purple button for Capture. Then you take your measurement device, ideally with your proper white-black backing. You measure the paper that you're checking to see if the color is right. And notice I just measured it. I didn't even tell it it was a substrate. And look right here, the OBA index is 10 and the fluorescent index is 8.4. So this paper is glowing. And if I put it in the light booth here without UV, you can see it's a really bright blue. You could also click on substrate here, measure that color again with the proper white backing. It comes up, and now you again see the OBA index and the fluorescent index, but you also see some paper-specific CIE whiteness and tint. And if you click on the fluoro tab, you can see this paper. The paper I showed in my presentation was a 30% increase in the blue. This one's more like a 40, it's a 38% increase in the blue due to the optical brighteners in this paper. So it's no wonder that instruments can't keep up with this level of optical brightener and you get a mismatch. and the delta E equation doesn't work well. So again, thank you for your attention. I hope you found this informative, and please test out ChromaChecker and see how it can benefit your workflow.